This isn't just another story about World War II. This is about what the Nazis were truly chasing, something far more bizarre than political power or military conquest.
It was so remarkable that the Nazis led in weapons technology.
Beneath the surface of tanks and tyranny was a deep, obsessive hunger for ancient magic, forgotten gods, and relics said to hold supernatural power. From sacred spears to Viking thunderbolts, they scoured the earth in search of artifacts that could rewrite history and reality itself.
It's too complex, and some of the items we can be very sure about the date of.
At the center of it all, a chilling belief that destiny was something you could hold in your hands if you were willing to defy death to find it. Let's dive in. The spear, the skull, and the superstition. The war didn't just begin on the battlefield, it began in the shadows, in ancient crypts, in whispers of forgotten power. Before the tanks rolled and the bombs fell, Adolf Hitler had already set his sights on a weapon unlike any other, the Spear of Destiny. Not a gun, not a bomb, but a relic, a sacred artifact said to hold the very power of life and death. He had seen it once as a boy, encased in glass, in a museum in Vienna. The moment stayed with him like a haunting. The spear was believed to be the one that pierced the side of Jesus Christ as he hung on the cross, a detail even referenced in the Bible, noting that one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. Hitler believed that owning the spear gave him a vision of the future, and from that vision, he carved out his twisted path toward power. It wasn't just spiritual fascination. Legends swirled around the spear, tales of Charlemagne wielding it for 47 victorious battles, only to die the very day he dropped it. Hitler saw history not as a lesson, but as a script to be rewritten, with himself as the star. And the spear? It would be his crown. In October 1938, under Hitler's direct orders, the spear was taken by train to Nuremberg. SS guards stationed it under lock and key inside St. Catherine's Church, where it remained until nearly the end of the war. On April 30th, 1945, mere hours before Hitler's suicide, the spear was captured by U.S. forces. Some still claim it was this act, this exact moment, that fulfilled the ancient prophecy once tied to Charlemagne. The spear had a new master, and Hitler's fate was sealed. But the spear was just one piece of a much larger obsession, one spear tip of a wider mythology that Nazi elites were desperate to control. No one was more fixated than Heinrich Himmler, the sinister architect of the SS. Himmler wasn't just a soldier or strategist. He believed in bloodlines, rituals, and reincarnations. To him, mythology was more than storytelling. It was a map to destiny, and he was determined to find its coordinates. That belief led him to a 10th-century king named Henry the Fowler, the founder of the first German state. Henry had died in 936, but Himmler saw him as a spiritual ancestor, a prototype for the Nazi ideal. Some even whispered that Hitler himself believed he was the reincarnation of the king. On July 2, 1936, exactly 1,000 years after Henry's death, Himmler led a candlelit ceremony inside the king's crypt in Quedlinburg. He proclaimed it a pilgrimage site for true Germans. Propaganda officials seized the opportunity, connecting Henry's legacy to Nazi ideology. His military campaigns were spun into stories of noble conquest, his rule into evidence of Aryan strength. But the grave held a secret. When Nazi officials opened the crypt, Henry's remains were gone. Queen Matilda's body was still there, untouched, but the king was missing. Himmler was humiliated. Under pressure to fix the narrative, his SS scrambled to recover the bones. Weeks before another grand ceremony, they miraculously found the king's body. Many believed it was a staged discovery. Regardless, the remains were reinterred in a midnight ritual, complete with organ music and dramatic speeches. Decades later, American troops would arrive in Quedlinburg. Priceless artifacts had vanished, jewel-covered tomes, ancient manuscripts, holy relics. One U.S. officer, Lieutenant Joe T. Meador, was eventually discovered to have smuggled many of the items out. Some were only returned to the church near the end of the 20th century. As for Henry the Fowler, his true resting place remains unknown. And so began a war not just of territory, but of myth. Mjolnir, myth, and the manufactured Aryan past. If the Nazis couldn't find proof of Aryan greatness in present-day Europe, they were determined to invent it by digging through myths, rewriting ancient history, and sometimes outright destroying it. Their obsession went far beyond battlefield dominance. They were fighting for a narrative, for a version of history that placed the so-called Aryan race at the dawn of civilization as the master architects of ancient knowledge, technology, and power. And Heinrich Himmler? He was the high priest of this twisted vision.
Don't underestimate Heinrich Himmler. This is a man, throughout the whole arc of the Nazi regime, is a man who grabs power little by little.
In 1940, Himmler wrote a now infamous letter to the Ahnenerbe, a Nazi think tank and pseudo-scientific research unit under his control, demanding an urgent investigation. His goal was simple and disturbing: to locate the real Mjolnir. Not the Marvel version, not comic book fiction, but the legendary hammer of Thor, the Norse god of thunder. To Himmler, Mjolnir wasn't just a mythological weapon. He believed it was a relic of ancient Aryan technology, possibly even an advanced electrical war weapon wielded by Germanic ancestors. In his words, this is not based on natural thunder and lightning, but rather an early, highly developed form of war weapon. According to his theories, Thor's hammer was evidence that Aryan warriors had once possessed knowledge of electricity and physics far beyond their time, knowledge that could be rediscovered and weaponized for the Third Reich. Under these bizarre assumptions, the Ahnenerbe launched expeditions throughout Scandinavia. Soldiers and scholars scoured ancient sites, gathering every statue, amulet, and carving remotely linked to Thor. They analyzed lightning symbols and Viking inscriptions. They compiled stories and hoarded artifacts, hoping one would turn out to be the real hammer. But no matter how deep they dug, Mjolnir eluded them. Still, the idea stuck. Even today, modern neo-Nazis and extremist groups use Thor's hammer as a symbol of power and racial purity, twisting its ancient meanings into something dark and politically dangerous. But Himmler's obsession with reimagining Aryan history didn't stop at Norse mythology. His ambitions stretched into every corner of the ancient world, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. One of the most damaging examples was the Nazi expedition to the island of Bohuslän in Sweden. There, 12,000-year-old petroglyphs, carvings etched into the stone by ancient hands, were said to represent a lost Aryan writing system. Hermann Wirth, a Nazi scholar and Ahnenerbe co-founder, presented Hitler with a slideshow of these petroglyphs. To Wirth, they were proof that the Aryans had developed a complex language before any other known civilization. Hitler was captivated. He ordered an official expedition. The team was instructed to make plaster casts of the carvings and bring them back to Germany. But the process was sloppy and destructive. They damaged the petroglyphs permanently, removing the context and even erasing some original shapes. And their research? Entirely unscientific. Their analysis relied on ideology, not facts. They didn't speak the languages of the regions they explored. They weren't archaeologists. They were believers trying to force history to confirm a myth. Even after the war, Hermann Wirth continued his research in Sweden. But by then, authorities had seen enough. He was eventually banned from the sacred site for incompetence and irreparable damage. At the heart of all this, the Nazis weren't searching for truth. They were searching for legitimacy. They wanted the world to believe that Aryan superiority was carved into the very stone of human history, that they were not just rulers of the present, but heirs of a mythical past. They failed in most of their quests, but the ruins they left behind, both physical and ideological, still echo through time. In myth, Mjolnir always returns to its master, but in this case, the hammer never came, and the world would never forget what was done in its name. stolen tapestries, false kings, and the collapse of a fantasy. In Nazi Germany, symbols mattered more than truth. Every myth they could claim, every artifact they could seize, was another brick in the illusion they were building. A fantasy of Aryan supremacy stretching back through time. Some relics were stolen, others were staged, and some, like the Bayeux tapestry, narrowly escaped their grip. The tapestry, an embroidered cloth nearly 70 meters long, depicts the Norman conquest of England in 1066, including the legendary Battle of Hastings. To Heinrich Himmler and his Nazi inner circle, this wasn't just a historic artifact, it was proof. In their minds, such intricate craftsmanship could only have come from Aryan hands. Himmler was so enamored with the tapestry that he had already chosen a spot for it in his private medieval castle. As Nazi forces swept into France, the tapestry was hidden in an underground vault, along with other national treasures. It remained protected for years, but by 1944, the Ahnenerbe had tracked it down and moved it to the Louvre under tight guard. Then came an order from Himmler himself. The tapestry was to be sent to Germany for safekeeping. But fate had other plans. The message was intercepted by British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who had cracked the Enigma code. When SS officers arrived to retrieve the tapestry, they were met not with cooperation, but with locked doors. Paris had been liberated, and the tapestry remained, returning to public display just in time for Winston Churchill's visit. What the Nazis had hoped to use as a symbol of dominance instead became a symbol of defiance. But not every story ended with a rescue. In the German town of Quedlinburg, deep in the heart of Saxony, Nazi officials had stored a collection of sacred relics, jeweled manuscripts, medieval tomes, and ornate reliquaries. These artifacts were meant to support the myth of a pure and noble Aryan past. But as the Allies advanced, the treasure vanished. For decades, it remained missing until an investigation in the 1990s uncovered the shocking truth. Lieutenant Joe T. Meter, a U.S. Army officer stationed in Quedlinburg after the war, had quietly smuggled the items home to Texas. His family kept them locked in a safety deposit box for years. It was only after media exposure and legal pressure that the treasures were finally returned. Still, one mystery from Quedlinburg refuses to rest: the whereabouts of Henry the Fowler's body. Himmler had declared the 10th century king the first true German ruler and a symbolic ancestor of the Nazi Reich. Elaborate ceremonies were held at his tomb, but when the crypt was opened, Henry's remains were gone. Though the SS later claimed to have found and reburied him in time for another staged event, many historians believe the body was never recovered. The Nazis wanted to claim the past as their own. They wanted artifacts, legends, and graves that told the story they needed. But again and again, the truth slipped from their grasp. Because history may be twisted, but it never forgets.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
Ahnenerbe, the think tank of madness. At the heart of Nazi ideology was a lie so large that it needed its branch of government to maintain it. That lie was Aryan supremacy, an invented identity that the Nazis tried desperately to prove with symbols, relics, and rewritten history. And their greatest tool in this quest wasn't a weapon or a general. It was the Ahnenerbe, a secret research unit that blurred the lines between archaeology, propaganda, and fantasy. Founded by Heinrich Himmler, the Ahnenerbe operated like a think tank for mythmakers. Its scholars weren't there to uncover the truth. They were there to find or fabricate evidence that the so-called Aryan race was the origin of civilization itself. According to them, anything powerful, beautiful, or ancient had to be Aryan, and if it wasn't, they would twist it until it was. One of their most damaging efforts took place on the island of Bohuslän in Sweden, home to some of the world's oldest petroglyphs, stone carvings dating back over 12,000 years. Nazi experts claimed these markings were part of a forgotten Aryan language, older than any writing known to man. Hitler, ever hungry for proof that supported his ideology, approved the expedition. But the team that went wasn't made up of archaeologists or linguists. They were ideologues with plaster and chisels. They made molds of the carvings, but in doing so, they left behind lasting damage, altering some symbols permanently and destroying the original context of the site. They didn't understand the language, the culture, or even the region, but that didn't matter. They weren't trying to understand history. They were trying to control it. The man behind this mission, Hermann Wirth, continued working on the glyphs even after the war, until Swedish authorities banned him from the site for good. His work was declared incompetent, and his alterations were irreversible. What could have been preserved as a sacred window into prehistoric life was instead treated as a political tool and left scarred. This was the pattern. Everything the Ahnenerbe touched, be it sacred relics, mythology, or anthropology, was distorted. They claimed that the Bayeux tapestry had been created by Aryans.
The supermen of the Aryan race had gone there, and in the fastness of Tibet.
They said Thor's hammer was an ancient Aryan electrical weapon. They insisted King Henry the Fowler was a spiritual ancestor to the Nazi regime. Each of these claims ignored real history and replaced it with carefully crafted lies. And yet, these lies were powerful. Symbols have weight. They tell stories. They shape identity. That's why the Nazis obsessed over them. Because they knew that if they could manipulate the symbols, they could manipulate the people. That's why their failure wasn't just scientific, it was ideological. In their search for an ancient truth that never existed, they destroyed parts of the real one. They chased myths, but what they left behind were real wounds, damaged artifacts, desecrated sites, and a cautionary tale about what happens when belief is allowed to silence fact. History doesn't need to be rewritten. It needs to be protected. Shadows, silence, and the aftermath of obsession. When the war finally ended, the battle for Europe's soul didn't stop. It just shifted underground. In hidden archives, in stolen artifacts, in the quiet corners of once occupied towns, the echoes of the Nazi obsession with the occult still lingered. What they couldn't control through force, they had tried to own through myth. What they couldn't prove, they faked. And in some cases, what they took was never given back. The remains of Henry the Fowler are still missing. For Himmler and his SS, the 10th century king wasn't just a historic figure, he was a symbol, a myth made flesh. In their eyes, Henry was the beginning of a 1,000-year German empire, a bloodline to be glorified, even deified. When his crypt in Quedlinburg was opened in 1936 during a Nazi-led ceremony, only his wife Queen Matilda's body was found. The king had vanished. In the following months, SS officers desperately searched local cemeteries. Conveniently, just before another grand Nazi ritual, the king's bones were discovered and dramatically reburied with candlelight and music. But historians have long questioned the authenticity of that body, and not everything stolen made it back. The case of the Quedlinburg church treasures is one of the most unsettling post-war mysteries. Priceless items, manuscripts, reliquaries, jeweled tomes, vanished as U.S. forces entered the town. Decades later, an American officer named Joe T. Meter was revealed to have smuggled the artifacts back to Texas. His family kept them for years in a safety deposit box. It wasn't until the late 20th century, after media investigations and legal battles, that most of the stolen relics were returned. The most curious thing? No charges were filed. The trail had gone too cold. Back in France, the Bayeux tapestry, nearly lost to Nazi hands, was saved at the last moment. The Nazis had planned to ship it to Germany, considering it a masterpiece of Aryan genius. But British codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted the order. When the SS arrived to take it, they were too late. Paris had been liberated. Winston Churchill arrived just in time to view the tapestry on public display, a symbol not of conquest, but of survival. In Sweden, the petroglyphs on Bohuslan's island remained scarred from Nazi interference. Their shapes, once ancient stories carved into stone, had been disfigured by careless hands. Scholar Hermann Wirth, whose ambition had helped drive the expedition, was eventually banned from returning. The Nazis failed in almost every objective they set for their Ahnenerbe. They found no magical weapons, no definitive evidence of a master race, no relics that could rewrite the past. What they did leave behind was damage, both visible and invisible. They taught the world how dangerous it is when myth replaces truth, when ideology manipulates science, and when history becomes a weapon. Their artifacts are back in museums, but the lies they told? Some still walk among us. History isn't just about what happened, it's about who controls the story. The Nazi regime tried to rewrite the past with stolen relics, staged rituals, and fabricated myths, hoping to build a future on illusion. They failed, but their pursuit left scars on ancient sites, sacred artifacts, and historical truth itself. What began as a search for power turned into a dark journey through delusion and destruction. Today, we still uncover the pieces they left behind. Broken, buried, but not forgotten. Because if we don't guard the truth, someone else will twist it. And that's a warning we can't afford to ignore.